Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a literal high-stakes geopolitical thriller. We're going to see exactly how India successfully navigated immense international pressure and round-the-clock satellite surveillance to become a nuclear power. It is an absolutely fascinating story of science, secrecy, and survival.
I mean, think about it. How do you hide a massive nuclear explosion from the CIA? Let's dive into the seemingly impossible scenario from 1998, where India managed to completely outsmart American spy satellites right in the harsh, open environment of the Thar Desert. But to truly understand how they pulled off such a colossal feat under the nose of the CIA, we've got to look back at the historical threats that ultimately forced India's hand.
To really get why India felt they needed this, we have to look at the geopolitical threat they were facing, a cascade of conflicts. You see, the original plan was totally different. Initially, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the legendary scientist Dr. Homi Bhabha envisioned nuclear energy solely for peaceful civilian development, like electricity. They even authorized projects strictly under this mandate. But, well, reality hit hard, and a series of regional conflicts quickly shattered that peaceful vision.
Look at this timeline. India faced a rapid string of devastating wars. In 1962, a war with China resulted in the loss of 38,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. Barely 2 years later, China successfully conducts its first nuclear test, officially joining the exclusive club of global nuclear powers. Throw in the Indo-Pakistani wars in 65 and 71, and you can see how India's security paradigm was completely upended. They realized they were surrounded and, honestly, incredibly vulnerable.
The real tipping point, though, came during that 1971 war. Picture this. India is cornered, not just by Pakistan, but by an unprecedented Western naval deployment. The U.S. sends Task Force 74. We're talking 75,000 tons and 70 aircraft straight into the Bay of Bengal. Meanwhile, the UK fleet is approaching from the Arabian Sea. India's INS Vikrant, sitting at 20,000 tons, was massively outgunned. It wasn't until the USSR stepped in with their own naval support that the US and UK backed down. That terrifying standoff convinced Indian leaders that relying on outside help just wasn't enough anymore. Nuclear deterrence was an absolute essential for national survival.
So that brings us to India's first test, famously known as Smiling Buddha. With this massive national security threat hanging over them, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi made a really decisive move. She greenlit a highly covert project, entrusting top scientists from the Bhabha Atomic Research Center and DRDO to build India's first nuclear device in absolute secrecy.
Working with severe resource constraints and relying entirely on their own ingenuity, they actually pulled it off. In May 1974, boom, India successfully detonates a 12-kiloton underground implosion device at the Pokhran test site. And let me tell you, that success sent absolute shockwaves through the global community.
When the explosion was confirmed, the secure signal sent back to Indira Gandhi was simply, "The Buddha has smiled." Now, she firmly maintained this was strictly a peaceful nuclear explosion meant for research. But the rest of the world, they weren't buying it. Nations like Canada, who had supplied reactor technology for peaceful power, felt totally betrayed and immediately severed all nuclear cooperation with India.
This reaction kicks off what we can call the treaty trap. Western nations suddenly woke up to a major new player on the board, and they aggressively attempted to box India in through a complex web of strict treaties and supply embargoes.
The big one was the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the crucial point here is that India flatly refused to sign it. You can kind of see their point. To them, it was a massive double standard. It essentially let 5 established nations hold on to their destructive power while outright denying vital self-defense capabilities to the rest of the world. India saw that as deeply unfair.
To further tighten the noose, the international community rolled out even more roadblocks. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, was introduced to ban testing entirely. Then the Nuclear Suppliers Group was formed specifically to cut off India's access to uranium and other resources. On top of all that, Western nations were constantly threatening harsh economic sanctions.
This intense geopolitical pressure reached a boiling point in 1995. Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao attempted to discreetly prep for another nuclear test at Pokhran. But actually, they just weren't secretive enough. Advanced CIA spy satellites caught the preparations red-handed, and U.S. President Bill Clinton immediately intervened, forcing a complete shutdown of the project. But the dream wasn't dead. Enter Operation Shakti.
When Atal Bihari Vajpayee took power in 1998, he immediately ordered the tests to resume. But having learned from '95, he knew that evading the unblinking gaze of orbiting American spy satellites was going to require unprecedented, almost superhuman levels of secrecy.
And this is where it gets wildly creative. The Army's 58th Engineer Regiment took charge. To trick the CIA, they used artificial vegetation and carefully rearranged sand dunes to camouflage the test shafts. They did all the heavy digging and moved critical equipment strictly at night when satellite vision was weakest. By dawn, everything was put back flawlessly. They even staged fake cricket matches to make overhead surveillance think it was just a boring idle army base.
The secrecy extended all the way to the top. Lead scientists like APJ Abdul Kalam operated in full army uniforms using military aliases like Major General Prithviraj. Even their flight tickets were booked under false names. And perhaps my favorite detail, the nuclear bombs themselves were transported into the desert under the insanely ironic code name White House to ensure absolutely zero intelligence leaks. And it worked. The preparations were completely invisible to the world. But on the actual day of the test, there was this incredibly tense delay. The wind directions in Pokhran shifted, threatening to blow radioactive fallout straight toward the nearby Pakistan border. The scientists just had to sit there and nervously wait for the winds to settle.
Finally, in May 1998, the moment of truth arrived. The Earth shook. India successfully detonated a total of 5 nuclear devices over the course of 2 days. And these weren't simple explosions. They proved India could build complex, weaponized devices using entirely indigenous tech and domestic resources.
Operation Shakti was a monumental scientific success that caught the CIA completely off guard. It was a genuine shock to the system. But, exactly as Indian leaders expected, the global aftermath was intense. The backlash was immediate. The US, Canada, and Japan all slapped India with severe economic sanctions. Back in Washington, the CIA director was basically forced to publicly admit to a colossal intelligence failure. They couldn't explain how they missed a full-scale nuclear program. Concurrently, the US and its allies loudly accused India of breaking international non-proliferation laws.
But here's the brilliant part legally. America couldn't actually pin any violations on India. Why? Well, India had never signed the NPT. They tested strictly underground, entirely bypassing the restrictions of the CTBT, which banned air and water tests. And because they used 100% domestic resources, they didn't violate the rules of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Legally speaking, India's slate was completely clean. Facing down this global outrage, leaders like Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam and Prime Minister Vajpayee stood absolutely firm. Their argument was pretty straightforward. Historically, India has never tried to invade any country. These weapons were strictly a defensive necessity, built solely to ensure the survival of a nation that had been repeatedly attacked.
Which leaves us with a pretty compelling final thought to chew on. When you look at the intense geopolitical pressures India faced from all sides and the sheer creativity required to protect its sovereignty, how do we weigh the ethics of nuclear deterrence against the absolute necessity of national defense? It's a massive question, and one that Operation Shakti permanently etched into history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.